Hey friends, welcome to this new show on our channel, Storytime with Chantastic, where we talk about the art and craft of UI engineering. Today we have an amazing guest. I'm super excited to kick this off with Brad Frost. Brad Frost, how the heck are you?
I am doing great. Thanks so much for having me. This is quite the honor.
Well, let's just dive in because I think that one of the reasons the reason that I wanted to start with you is because so much of what Storybook and Chromatic are doing with, component driven development and component driven design, I feel was kind of like spiritually kicked off by the work that you did with Atomic Design and the book that you wrote. And so I thought, we should just go back to the source and talk with Brad about what was happening at the time that you wrote that, what has happened in the time since, because there's been a lot of change since then, and just kind of like where you see our industry right now and where it's going. So first and foremost, like how many years has it been since you published the first version of Atomic Design?
So Atomic Design, the book is at 2015, but so it's
Wow.
really 2013 though was when it was actually born. So it was really born of some of our my very first freelance client projects, and so we kind of kicked the tires with it and kind of put it to work for we did a redesign of the technology blog
Okay. Yep.
techcrunch.com
Yeah.
dot com, and then also Entertainment Weekly, the sort of entertainment publication. And those were kind of the first two client projects that I did on my own. And I kind of came from the agency world, and there's things are starting to sort of formulate in my head there. But it was really sort of whenever I went out on my own and working with Josh Clark and Dan Mall that I said, hey, I have this idea, and along with that idea came what became Pattern Lab, where I basically just kind of wrote some PHP and sort of wrote a little sort of a UI frame, and then sort of had an iframe inside of it to sort of like, sort of create these patterns and be able to sort of, navigate between them and stuff like that. So all of that was January 2020 or 2013 that sort of kicked it all off. And sort of at the time, Bootstrap was emerging as a thing, but at the time, whenever we were sort of doing TechCrunch and Entertainment Weekly, it was not, hey, we need a design system or we need a
Yeah.
component library. There's none of that. It was we need a responsive website, right? We need
Interesting.
a responsive website, and I hired us to make a responsive website. And whenever I was working on, so my background, I worked in an agency called RGA as a mobile web developer. And this was like late 2009. So the iPhone had come out, but the web hadn't really turned its attention
Sure.
to sort of creating websites that were to be optimized for this stuff. So I was creating like
Nice.
m.nike.com and m.mastercard.com and all of that stuff. And then, but also got to create, it was like, because of the clients we had, we got to create ipad.nike.com. And so I kind of got exposed even sort of before responsive design was even a thing. It was like we are creating kind of an experience that was meant to travel to their iPhone specific website, their non-iPhone mobile specific website, their new iPad website, and their desktop website. So it was like kind of like these like four containers, and we were like, well, how do we create like kind of like one flexible experience that could sort of like be sort of plunked into these four things? So not quite responsive design, meaning is like the whole
Sure.
page was like this, but it was like we were trying to create that, and sort of doing that work sort of led to, okay, responsive experiences, kind of creating these experiences, these user interfaces that adapt to different screen sizes and things like that. It's not the page that's hard. It's that navigation is hard, all right? How do you go from a horizontal list of links to something that's different on small screens? Or like breadcrumbs are hard, or like an image gallery is hard,
Yeah.
or data tables are hard. So that's what sort of like had me sort of working on these sort of component based
Hmm.
things. That's what kind of like led me that road. And so I created a project called This Is Responsive, which was kind of a collection of all the different sort of ways you could slice a responsive data
Oh,
table
cool.
or responsive navigation, and sort of, and it's just like kind of rounded up what other people were doing and stuff as well, just kind of under one roof. Just like, here's 6 different ways you could do navigation. Here's 6 different ways you could do an accordion. Here's 6 different ways you could do this, that, or the other. And so that was kind of my introduction. There was through responsive design, and then that sort of led to around this sort of 2013 time, getting hired to do these responsive
Hmm.
sites. It was like the bootstraps had come out, and like people are like, here's like a pattern library, and you could create pages out of this collection of patterns. And I was like, yeah, but it's pretty crude.
Mm.
It's like a pretty
Yeah.
crude thing. Or it's like, here's a bunch of Lego bricks, like, rummage through the pile, put them together, and you could make a thing. It's like, obviously we understand what that is, but that was where I kind of felt that lacking, sort of the level of nuance that
Yeah.
we needed to actually do this thoughtfully in a very sort of hierarchical way. And so that's what led to atomic design, was sort of by sort of splitting things out into sort of further buckets. When at the end of the day, everything's a component. Sure, that all sort of jives with a lot of the sort of like modern lingo, or how tools like React think about things. But it's like, by sort of splitting them out into like the smallest unit, calling that like an
Yeah.
atom, and then the sort of like these relatively simple components, calling those molecules, relatively complex components, calling those organisms, and then sort of going even further and sort of stitching those together into actual templates, and then pouring real data and states into those templates to build actual pages. By doing that, we are able to sort of like, one, sort of isolate these components and sort of like treat them
Hmm.
as like their own things with their own properties, but then to be able to combine them and sort of and then embody their own properties, but then be able to sort of draw a straight line
Sure.
between, like, here's this like checkbox. Here's how that checkbox plays out in
Yep.
like a checkbox field. Here's how that checkbox field enters into this form. And here's how that form ultimately ends up like on a checkout flow somewhere. So we were able to sort of draw that straight line through like the most sort of basic building block, all the way through like, here's the actual thing that our clients are
Yeah.
paying us to
Yeah.
build. And so what's funny is that in those early projects for TechCrunch and Entertainment Weekly, and really for the first 3 years, maybe, it was like, we're like, hey, here's your new website. And oh, by the way, here's this like very thoughtful, pattern driven, carefully constructed, well thought out sort of component library that sort of goes along with it. And they're like, that's nice, trash can. Because like, what they wanted was a responsive website. We delivered that website, and they were good websites. But there was like no interest or desire to really. They're like, oh, that's cool, and we're like, yeah, they could like save you time and like all of that stuff, but clients weren't asking for that. So it's like really like around like sort of 2016, 2015, 2016 that people actually started going like, oh, hey, like there's actually something to all of these sort of like building blocks. So that was an interesting shift beyond just like, please make us a website
Yeah.
or a responsive website or a
That
thing.
that's so
Yeah.
wild to
To
think of a time, because design systems and component libraries and pattern libraries or whatever have been so successful, like a concept, since I think, as you
Mhm.
mentioned, like 2015 is when they kind of like started to take off, and then just really like they're everything now. And it seems
Yeah.
like it's kind of tied to this cultural shift of maybe thinking differently about like the maintenance of something long term. Whereas back in 2013 it was just like, we need a website, like we need you to redo our website. It's like an artifact, and then we're just going to keep doing it until we do it again. And now that
Yep.
whole thing has really changed to thinking about design a little bit more holistically, of kind of the user experience, and how these how these layouts could persist through design iterations, and how parts of your site could
Yep.
live on indefinitely through like multiple like rebrands and whatnot, and kind of like
Mm-hmm.
separating some of those maintenance burdens, I guess, which is
Yeah.
interesting. I'm curious. So you mentioned 2013 was the time that you were exploring this, and 2015 was about the time that component libraries started to take off, and design system, that whole bucket of concepts. Um, and I'm curious, how much of that do you think is related to the the React component kind of really enforcing the component model, like the isolation of all of these things? Because in 2013, I think React was just starting to kick off, but before that, what were you delivering websites in for the most part?
Yeah. It's a good point. So I see it as, so 2013 and before, right? It's like, just even sort of before we're officially doing that, it's like you would have like a folder called like includes or something like that, right? In a project, and like whatever that project might be, right? So you might have like in like a WordPress theme, it's like WordPress theme
Yeah,
includes, and then it's like header, footer, maybe you'd have like, blog card, or like, so you might have sort of some of
yeah,
that stuff. And and of course, in the sort of pre-modern JavaScript era, you would be building in whatever backend
hmm.
technologies your stack was in, right? So for me, it's like I did a lot of like WordPress and kind of like PHP,
Yeah,
Magento, e-commerce sites and sort of stuff like that. But then other places, it's like, whatever, Blade, and like there's all these like weird sort of, yeah, Wesley Snipes sounding names of templating engines and
for
backend
sure.
languages and stuff like that. So it's like you had this sort of semblance of sort of like a dynamic thing where it's like, oh, you could carve out, you could print the title and the description or sort of something like that. So it's like you'd lean into that. But ultimately, in 2013 and and before then, and sort of like leading
Yeah,
up to the React sort of world, I guess, is it would be, yeah, we'd sort of build things in Mustache or build things in sort of some of these more sort of back end focused things, but ultimately that would need to be sort of ported over and kind of recreated in the environment, in the actual sort
hmm.
of environment that we're doing. So with Pattern Lab, we are sort of doing all of this in well, first raw PHP, just because that's what I knew. But then Dave Olson came onto the project, kind of rewrote it all to use Mustache to better support that. But our client projects were not sort of using Mustache or anything like that. What we were tasked with was delivering the front end of this
Yeah,
sort of code, and then a team would be sort of responsible for integrating that code into whatever the application was. So a few things is that one of the things that I think that we kind of did right, which was create what I call a front end workshop environment that's separate from a WordPress site or a Drupal site or a Next.js app or a Gatsby site or like whatever. It's like, here's this place where that's dedicated to building the front of the front end of this
yeah,
experience. It's not wired up to any services. It doesn't care about databases. You don't have to like npm install like the universe just to sort of like style your buttons. Here's this place. But in the sort of early 2010s or whatever, that involves sort of having to do sort of a big kind of leap into the actual sort of
yeah,
environment, and it was disconnected. It was not actually connected, right? The best you could get is kind of like checking in like a bootstrap, put a version on like the minified CSS file, and you could kind of version control it like
Sure.
that. But these are not directly consumable components. So what React and these other sort of modern JavaScript frameworks like Angular and the rest of them did was sort of open the door to actually being able to ingest and import and use these
Yeah.
components directly.
Yep.
Like there's like an
Yeah.
actual connection, and that for me has been an evolution. Like as a practitioner, that has been like, okay, now I can control and retain that control of the front end markup, of the styles, of the accessibility of the internals of these components, and then the user developers can interact with it, handshake with it via the components API. And what that allows us to do is to sort of like create this really healthy division of labor that, and again, I use this sort of like framing of the front end developers who specialize in HTML, CSS, presentational JavaScript, accessibility, responsive design, all of that great stuff, which is critically important to a product. And then back of the front end developers who are responsible for wiring it up to services, writing business logic, making the whole thing work, all the CRUD stuff, all the authorization stuff, the cache validation, all that jazz. Also very important for making the product go. And historically, these things have just been kind of kludged together under this sort of like, you're a developer, like just do this. And I that's like one of my big like sort of soapbox things is I'm like, look, these are both very important facets to creating great work and great software, but often, especially the front end world tends to be very sort of just like disrespected
Sure.
or thought of as an
Yeah.
afterthought because it's like, oh, HTML and CSS, these are just like these very like sort of like plain language things, like we could do this, it's easy, blah blah blah. It's sort of just ugh. But so with this sort of rise of these sort of modern JavaScript frameworks, and this is why I really encourage everybody to kind of, it took a while, and you know this, you were there with me as we sort of called on you to help. It's like we knew our respective sort of
Yeah.
space, but we didn't know sort of some of like the nuances of this sort of like all JavaScript kind of stuff, like the JSX kind of stuff, or other frameworks is the same but different. And but to be able to sort of like know enough of that to get to a place where you're able to sort of package up your
Hmm.
accordion and alert and button and card and data table and all that stuff, and be able to sort of publish that as this sort of thing that then other people could pull down, like that unlocks just so much really amazing stuff, and again sort of preserves the kind of integrity of everyone's respective work. And I really like
Yeah.
that. So yes, that was like a that I don't know, when did React like really start blowing up, because it was like around, probably around
I
that
think
time, right?
so.
2013,
Yeah, so
2015, I
that's why
don't
I'm kind
know.
of like fascinated by the timeline because I know it was announced like summer 2013, which is about the same time that you're working on Atomic Design, and I think it did start. 2015 was probably when that hockey stick started showing up, right? Like people were starting to like get on board, and everything was
Yep.
happening, and really catching the vision of like what it means to isolate like a full component, like
Mm-hmm.
everything about it.
Yep.
And I think 2015 I gave a talk talking about, it was one of the early like CSS and JS talks, and just that idea of like we can literally put everything in a component if we want to. And I don't know, I regret parts of that, but it's really interesting because I can see, like right now it sounds absurd that a company would take the work that you've done in a pattern library and throw that out, right? Like that feels
Yeah.
like the core
Right.
artifact that people want. And so in hindsight it sounds just wild that would ever happen. But when you describe it like this, it kind of makes sense, right? Like they were paying you for the
Mm-hmm.
website, and you had
Mm-hmm.
created this alternate environment in which you could be productive without having all of the access to the application. Um, And so
Mm-hmm.
you'd created a space which kind of like duplicated the parts of the world that you needed without having to touch the entire stack. And like that was kind of
Mm-hmm.
the core separation. But in the years, in those years afterwards, like kind of after 2015, with the advent of components, it kind of, because they were more capable, now that thing, like those worlds came back together, right? And so it kind of ties
Mm-hmm.
into these terms that you're using of like, front of the front end and back of the back of the front end, where now
Yep.
you could develop something in isolation like you were doing with Pattern Lab, but then also use those same artifacts to build the UI instead of just kind of having it
Yep.
be like a simulation of the environment. It's like you're using the same
Yeah.
things.
Yeah, it's like it's like what would happen is like we were able to sort of build the CSS file and use that
Mm-hmm.
directly, but like any markup, and this held true for tools like Bootstrap or Foundation, where it's just like import this, reference the
Mm-hmm.
CSS file, and then sort of match all of your class names, and then you will get the look and feel. But in order to match all the class names, you had to, as a developer, recreate.
Yeah.
You had to own that, and that meant that if Bootstrap released a new version that changed some class names or something like that, or you sort of like whatever is
Yeah.
detached, right? And then yeah, like with the rise of these sort of more sort of modern uh JavaScript frameworks, and I'm not sure of the timeline around sort of ES
Sure.
modules and all that. So like the sort of like
Yeah.
base level functionality of like being able to import these components and sort of reference these things in that way. It's like that also I'm sure plays into it. But it's like once that's there, that really does unlock this sort of way that we're working now, which I think is again very, very healthy and very
Yeah,
welcome.
yeah, yeah. I totally agree. It's really interesting. I like the term that you used for this because you'd mentioned it, the idea of a front end workshop environment, and
Yes.
it sounds to me like in this time, so the core innovation that you were able to create was to separate that workshop environment, but over that kind of handful of years, you were able to now like kind of connect to the workshop environment and then the production environment. Like now there's some like
Yeah.
connective tissue, whereas before they were totally separate, like more like a lab, and then you bring that lab research back to the code. Now they're like there's a pipeline.
That's right. That's right. And there still is, and we sort of still wrestle with this today, working with different client teams. So one of the ways that we use these front end workshop environments, and we'll say, namely Storybook these days, is like most storybooks we encounter whenever I sort of consult with other organizations on their design system work. They're like, here's our storybook, and you'll see what you would expect to see. You'll see the buttons and the cards and like the button groups and the form controls and all of that. And you're like, that's nice. But like one of the things that we've done since 2013 to present that we still don't see, aside from the clients we work with directly, is like actually sort of like building the full
Mm-hmm.
screens, like actual like user flows. Like here's the homepage, here's this checkout flow, here's the product detail page, here's like the product listing page, like all of that stuff. Like you are able to create all of that. And what we do is we kind of like that becomes the handoff, right? It's
Sure.
it's it's no longer just like here's a static comp in Figma or Sketch or whatever, and then you throw it over to the developers who have to again code the whole thing up. It's here is literally like the view layer of your application, just with like hard coded, sort of text in there for like your product grid or whatever. It's like it's not hooked up to the API that actually like sucks in all the sort of product data or whatever, but like this gives you what you need to sort of build this. And it also gives this sort of standalone
Yeah.
environment to sort of really make sure that the UI part of it is sturdy, right? Like the performance of that thing, the accessibility of that thing, like, cause sometimes it's like, you don't know. It's like, oh, it's that markup whoops was like generated by the backend service,
Sure.
or the performance of this thing is slowed down by some backend sort of stuff. So it's like we continue to have this kind of fuzzy, what do we do with this thing? This like these sort of templates and pages that we build out and represent in
Yeah.
Storybook. Sometimes our clients are like, but like, do we like ingest this like directly? And we're like, no, like you kind of still like copy and paste it, recreate it. And it's okay for this to be kind of like an artifact. And like, you don't want to get into a game where you're like trying to maintain this thing like long term. It is kind of like a comp, it is
Yeah.
kind of like a prototype. But at the same time, that it serves a very important role in this game, to sort of validate all of those like lower level components where it's like, how do we
Yeah.
know if like that the buttons do what they need to do and have all the prompts they
Yeah.
need to have, and like everything sort of hangs together properly? Like you need to validate that. And what we talk about is like, in a lot of the clients we work with, where they have, sure, their component library, but the only place they're like validating those components is in the actual product. That's still like a,
Yeah.
publish the library, npm update, sort of plug it in, and then like sort of bring it back as like sort of like a bug
Yeah.
feature kind of thing. By having all of that sort of co-located in this front end workshop environment in Storybook, by sort of recreating that, the feedback loop is much shorter. And
Yeah.
that's really what atomic design is all about, is kind of connecting real products to the design systems that power those products, and to sort of have this super tight feedback loop of, oh, the product detail page needs
Yeah.
this, which means I need to sort of go back to, the lower level, sort of more atomic component, make those changes, and then be able to sort of zoom back out to the product, detail page, to make sure that that all worked. It didn't break anything else. So that's like the kind of, I think, the beauty of atomic design, but the beauty of atomic design sort of played out through Storybook is having that super tight
Yeah.
feedback loop that serves as this like, we feel supremely confident in what we're delivering from a front end
Yeah.
perspective. And then the back end perspective, what that does is that unlocks us to be able to sort of support the engineers who are then sort of like plugging this stuff in, which is really cool. It just helps so many different
Yeah.
things, because otherwise, especially in the early days of a design system, as you're creating these things, you're really trying to build confidence, you're trying to
Yep.
build trust, you're trying to build relationships. And if people plug your stuff in and it just like totally falls down,
Yeah.
like, for a lot of people, it's like, that's game over. It's like, like, this is just too
Yep.
much work. I don't have time to be sort of like fielding all of this stuff. So it's like, that's where it's like this kind of environment where you're able to really just beat the crap
Yeah.
out of your UI and make sure that it's like actually doing the job you're needing it to do, is just like, it does wonders for just instilling confidence in the design system you're producing.
Yeah. As you're talking about this, I think, we talked about the core, one of the winning bets being that front end workshop environment, but there's more to it than that too. It's that, in atomic design, you broke things out into like a notion that I think, like, I hadn't seen before, like, personally, like the idea, but I think I've experienced the pain of it before, which is, you go to Bootstrap and you're like, I'm gonna install Bootstrap because it's there, it's free, and I can, like, get up and running with it. And we saw so many startups in that era, like that kind of like immediately post Bootstrap, where it was like everything looked like a Bootstrap site, and it's because it
Yeah.
lacked what atomic design introduces, which is the idea of like fit and finish for a page, right, or for an organism.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that these things, you're going to have these pieces, and they're kind of like off the shelf. It's like off the rack kind of, pieces. But when you go
Yep.
to design that checkout form, right, or that full page that has the checkout form nested inside of it, there are these necessary breakages that you have to do to all of those pieces to give it that fit and finish. as a page, as a
Yeah.
layout. And a lot of times, like we don't see that represented in the, like, oh, I made a like design system and it's got 5 buttons and 5 input sizes and whatever. And as long as you don't, do anything, like everything should work. And you try to use it and it just looks
Hmm.
like another site using Bootstrap.
Yeah. 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 That's right. It's like, and we have that now with, material
Yep.
design and the rest of it. And there are places for those, and especially like if you're talking about startups who are just like trying to sort of like get something off the ground and validate
Totally.
something really, really quickly, uh, then that's like a good place to sort of like reach for something off the shelf, especially if you don't have that sort of like front end expertise sort of inside your walls and stuff. So it's like, I get it. It's good for that. But I think that you touched on something earlier, like this sort of mental shift from going from, oh, we're just like going to burn our website down and rebuild it. And then we're going to go, 3 to 5 years later, we're going to do the exact same thing and burn it down again and sort of replace it. It's like what we're talking about is moving more towards like a product
Hmm.
mentality where it's like, we are investing in this thing, this software we are intending on sort of like living on, and we could build upon it and iterate it and evolve it over time. And if that's like the situation you're in, and this is what I tell a lot of my workshop attendees and consulting clients and stuff that are like asking, they're like, why are we even doing this ourselves whenever material
Sure.
already
Yep.
exists, or Chakra UI, or or even still like Bootstrap and stuff, especially now that these things are sort of built into, material UI, like there's a React framework and, Bootstrap, React Bootstrap and things like that. It's like, well, like, why wouldn't we just do
Sure.
that? And really what we're talking about is like, exactly what you're saying. It's like you can do that, but it's just going to like it's going to look off the shelf, but it's also not likely going to sort of like fit all of your user needs and business
Hmm.
needs, especially like as you're sort of like working at an organization that is like, has a lot you know sort of invested in a bespoke
Yeah.
brand, has like a specific mission, you're trying to do different things like, there that's whenever you go get into it. But even from a technical standpoint, it's like going like, we have opinions about like how we write software
Yeah.
here, and to sort of reach for an off the shelf thing, it's like it doesn't have those sort of same principles built into it as you're going to sort of have in house. So I think that it's overall, if you're thinking about this sort of more like product mindset and sort of like really sort of saying, we're going to build some stuff to that we're going to own and grow and evolve and like really, listen to our users, listen to our business needs, and like all of that stuff. It's like you need to be able to do whatever you need to do. And oftentimes that's whenever you run into the sort of friction of when you're reaching for and
Yeah.
relying on these sort of third party tools. You're like, but this doesn't give us that. And then so it's like, well, what do we do? And
Sure.
then you have to hack it to pieces, or like, sort
Yeah.
of people do all sorts of crazy things on top of it. So I tend to err on the side of, look, you're a smart person. You likely work with really smart people. Like, take the time to like do things in a way that you feel good about, and can sort of use as a foundation to
Yeah.
carry your team and your organization forward, and you'll be better for it. I think by sort of like it is a little slower to do it
Yeah.
that way, but at the same time, that's what kind of unlocks a lot of that sort of like long term health versus the kind of, we did this, we didn't have to think about it,
Yeah. Yeah.
and then yeah.
Well,
So
this is something
I don't know.
that keeps popping to mind, kind of in that marriage of atomic design and storybook and the idea of component driven design in the
Mm-hmm.
um, in storybook with React components or with your UI language of choice, is that there's something kind of interesting that's happened over the last couple of years, and I'm curious to get your take on this, which is atomic design talks about a handful of different pieces. And so you have your atoms and your molecules and your organisms and layouts and pages. And it sounds to me like as tooling gets better, so you have like chakra or stitches recently, right? Or uh
Mm-hmm.
tailwind is like super popular for the CSS side of things. You could still use
Mm-hmm.
those, but then construct in a reusable way all of your like layouts and pages together in a like kind of like testable, repeatable kind of way that is still borrowing from or still utilizing the work that's gone in the community. So you're getting some part of that for free, maybe the like atoms and the molecules, but then like your organisms, the things that actually are part of your business, part of your brand, require that extra fit and finish, are something that you can take full control of, and then kind of develop components around, test those in isolation, make sure all of the
Mm-hmm.
accessibility is correct and whatnot. Do you, when you're partnering with design system teams and brands, do you find that that is a kind of like reasonable strategy to like borrow from tooling that exists today, but then kind of using something like Storybook in this front end workshop environment to kind of make that your own? So not starting from the ground up, but like kind of starting from what you have, and then building it up into these like kind of like the things that represent your brand the most.
Yeah, I think that you're right in saying that like as you sort of get these more sort of complex components, like the sort of organism level thing, and then certainly into sort of like templates and pages, you're sort of like arriving more at like these concrete things that are sort of part of your
Hmm.
application versus another organization's. But like as you sort of like go more towards like atoms and molecules kind of things, it's like, yeah, you get like checkboxes, you get like radio fields, you get like text inputs and like things like
Mm-hmm.
that are you'll find the internet over. So there is like a lot of commonality sort of to those, at least sort of in structure. Now, whether or not you use sort of third party tools like Tailwind, for instance, as like sort of a basis for that is up to individual teams. And I kind of we've worked with different teams who have done that to at least sort of like kind of like what you're saying. It's almost like sort of like taking inspiration from that. We're sort of like
Sure.
cherry picking sort of like some of that, or like using sort of some of those sort of like lower level or sort of more like primitive values. Like we were working with a startup, for instance, that was kind of just using Tailwind sort of like
Okay.
colors to get them going, while they were sort of like they were working with the branding agency to sort of like put like more of a sort of specialized thing
Sure.
in place, but like to reach for something that was like, oh, this is already sort of considered. Now, of course, and this isn't a knock on Tailwind or anything like that, but this just goes to show like how uh, none of this stuff like solves your problems just like for free. So they would like reach for Tailwind's sort of color palette and would put sort of colors together that weren't accessible and all of that stuff. So we had to kind of like work with them to sort of like increase contrast and sort of do things. And they kind of like pass the buck on to Tailwind. It's like, yeah, but you kind of need to, you kind of need to like still like do it, wield these tools properly. But that's kind of, I tend to like not have a horse in this race. It's like people are like, whoa, and do these like weird like false dichotomies. So like, well, what about like atomic design versus tail? I'm like, they're not the same. Atomic design has nothing to do with CSS. It has nothing to do with
Sure.
JavaScript. Like literally the only place in our code that we use the terms like atoms, molecules, and organisms are in our storybook files,
Yeah.
where we sort of just like nest will be like atoms, forms, checkbox, atoms, forms, radio, and those would just be like the atom bits
Interesting.
of our form controls. That will have molecules, forms, text field, molecules, form, radio field, and stuff
Yeah.
like that. So it's like that, but that's the only place in code that atomic design sort of like
Hmm.
manifests itself, and you don't have to do
Sure.
that. It's more than anything, we're like, It's a mental model to think about UI in this nested hierarchical way. And so long as you're thinking about that and thinking about this sort of Russian nesting doll approach to building components and ultimately full screens, then you're practicing atomic design. So it's like you don't find it baked into our like CSS or like our class names or anything like that. But anyways, coming back to sort of like the Tailwind stuff, one of the nice things about these sort of what we were talking about earlier, these like directly consumable components, is that all of this is sort of abstracted away from the end
Sure.
user, which actually means that you could use BEM, you could use specs, you could use a utility based like approach, you could use like really whatever you want really in order to make your button look like the button that you want. And I kind of like that. I kind of like that because it does, again, like you, the people who are writing that front of the front end code need to care about that. But the
Mm.
users could be none the wiser about sort of like how things are architected and stuff like that. The only thing I'll say, like on the sort of subject of like how we approach CSS is that, and we talked about this a little earlier with this sort of, um, being able to kick out a CSS file, which is what we used to do
Yeah.
historically before these directly consumable components. There is absolutely, especially at the bigger the organizations we work with, which is most of our work these days. But even at sort of like more like medium sized places, it's like there will be we have our Tumblr blog, or we have our Shopify site, or we have our other thing. And it's like we can't import our React components, or we can't import like
Interesting.
these directly consumable things. So what we still find a more sort of class based, well, dare I say, traditional CSS approach to give us that ability to sort of just like kick
Yeah.
out our styles and then just be able to plug that into literally any environment. And even if it's like a Shopify theme or whatever, you could sort of still like sort of match those classes and get that for free. Now, again, it's
Yeah.
detached, like we were sort of talking about earlier, but at the same time, especially whenever you're working with such a large organization that has so many different web properties, the chances that all of them are going to be running React or even
Yep.
can run React or whatever your tech stack of choice is it it gets pretty low pretty quickly, where it's just like, oh yeah, you could get our orange buttons. All you have to do is totally re-architect your entire tech ecosystem. So that's why like and again, I'm like, I understand CSS and JS solutions. I think it makes sense in the context if you're
Totally.
just looking at a like React framework or sort of something like that. But whenever my work is always, let's go in and audit your entire technology landscape and build a design system that's meant to ultimately power that, or at least have the potential to power that, because our users don't care if the homepage is a Drupal site, this other part of the flow is like powered by Craft, this part of the experience is on React, and this other thing's on Angular, and this other thing's on Vue. They don't care. But like to have that sort of consistency and continuity between all of the experiences, like that's what actually matters. So that's why, yeah, good old CSS is very, very portable.
There's something really beautiful about
So
standards, right?
I like it. I like it.
Yeah, I think it's funny because I feel like there's the and we're kind of in the weeds on that, but I'll try to bring it back a little bit. Like I think that this is one of the beauties of having that front end um, workshop environment, is that you are working in a way that is isolated from the frameworks, and so you can kind of decide
Mm-hmm.
how much you want to, how much you want to isolate yourself, but at the same time, like being able to do that, you can work in an environment that then empowers you to approach other environments later, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
I think that's something that's really fascinating about that concept, especially with atomic design, and then that idea of just the idea of kind of that front of the front end being able to kind of like focus on fit and finish. And I'm curious specifically about that right now. Like, as we become more and more aware as developers about the impact of kind of like accessibility, as we find out more, I'm going to try to put this graciously, right? As we find out more challenges that we create for ourselves as we make single page applications, um, do you find that that is also a benefit to having kind of this isolated environment where you can work on those organisms and make sure that, like, check out or whatever it is, like these core views, that they get wrapped up and kind of tested and um, worked. I'm not exactly sure what I'm trying to say here, but like, do you find that there's like a value to having this front end workshop for really like um, inspecting and like and manipulating these particular like core views that are critical to business and whatnot?
Yeah. Oh, I mean, 100%. And again, just like there is something like accessibility is such a great lens to like look at all this through, because it's like if you boil down the most sort of like basic text field, um, it's like you have a label and you have an input. And in order for those things to be accessible, those need to have a relationship, right? So we add a for attribute to our label in order to have a relationship to the ID of that input. Now, that's like HTML 101, but those are like the if you go to any website, I can guarantee you're going to find at least one
Yeah,
instance of like a text field that the label and the input, even if they visually look closer together, they are not connected at the HTML
yeah,
level, right? Or the label is just sort of absent or whatever, right? It's not visually hidden, but still accessible to screen readers. So just even that, just managing the relationship between these two HTML tags is like this like low level, just
yeah,
common, just like the lowest of low hanging fruit. So to be able to sort of have that little molecule just kind of take care of that
yes,
for you, and I've written about this, like how you can sort of expose those as props, right, to be able to sort of pass in an ID, and that would get sort of applied to the
hmm,
for in the label and would get applied to the input. But then you also, whenever you sort of start talking about helper text, like your password must be at least 8 characters long or whatever, then that introduces a third HTML element that then also needs to have a relationship with this input. And again, now you're juggling two sets of relationships between three HTML tags, which again, not hard, but very hard to do consistently across,
yeah,
every single form that you have on your site. So the ability to sort of isolate these low level kind of like molecules in Storybook and be able to sort of test these
yeah,
things and be able to go, this exists. And like even cooler, what we've done in the what we do is we sort of expose these things as props, so you can pass those in for specific names. But even if you omit them, or if the developer that's sort of using this sort of text field omits them, it will go, oh, looks like it wasn't provided, so I'm actually going to generate like a gobbledygook kind of
yeah,
string, so that it always has that relationship. So there's like that sort of like quality control there that you're able to sort of test and really hang your hat on, that it's like this form field is accessible. But then you're also able to, as you sort of plug this into a broader organism or page level kind of thing, there's other accessibility
right,
considerations, things like focus trapping and tab order, and just like making sure that everything sort of hangs together. That ability to sort of isolate and sort of really test, again, what you're doing is really like instilling confidence that like this UI is accessible, and to be able to focus on that, because there does tend to be stuff on the back end that will end up
yeah,
influencing, sort of like some of the labels. So it's like a bit of quality control, but more than anything, it's just like this. You are able to sort of bake some of these best practices in at the component level, at all the different levels, whether that's atom, molecule, organism, or whatever. You're able to sort of like consider these things, isolate them, validate them, all of that stuff, which allows you to sort of confidently publish a library and pull it in. And that if like somebody sort of comes back to the experience and sort of says like, oh, like this isn't working or this isn't accessible or whatever, you're able to sort of be like, here's the receipts over
Yeah.
here in our storybook environment that sort of show it
Yeah.
working here. And that again sort of it unlocks like a new dimension of
Yes.
QA that like historically it's like, I don't know, is this like coming from the back end?
Yeah.
Is this like a problem with like a service, or is this like an actual like UI bug? And it's like so great to be able to sort of like have this thing to check
Yeah.
against that it's just like really, really
Yeah,
helpful.
yeah, yeah. I like that idea that you talk about, like kind of having receipts, right? Like we know that from this point, in as much as we've documented, this, molecule, organism, whatever in Storybook, like we know that it's good at this point, right? And so there's something else that's kind of screwing it up. But then also to have that capability to then expand that even to test things now at the whole page level, right? To incorporate that,
Yep.
like molecule or organism into a page, and then be like, oh yeah, and like recreate that environment and say like, oh yeah, because
Yeah.
this is on the page, now we need to consider that part of the accessibility and the navigability of this
Yep.
site. And so then adding that
Yep.
now as a test, it's kind of cool because it's like testing, but like for UI tooling, as opposed to like having to do all this stuff, like run your whole app and then like do a bunch of queries to make sure that this selector is on the page and like whatever. Like
Yeah.
to be able to do that in a UI environment, or like kind of like a front of the front end friendly
Yeah.
environment, is
Yeah.
it's so cool.
Yeah. Seriously, it really is. And especially in like, I'll sort of say something that's pretty controversial, but also probably not. But it's like testing's historically been really rough for
Yes.
us because like it's been like picture in your mind's eye a modal and imagine clicking on a button that would happen to trigger that modal. And like so a lot of like what Storybook's been doing have been sort of following along really closely, where it's like, yeah, okay, we can actually like play this stuff out and like sort of like recreate these like clicks and like but actually do
Yes.
it in the way that like we always do it whenever we like build it for real, and the way that like most users will actually experience this thing, which is I see a button, I click on that button, it triggers the modal, I click on that close button, it closes the modal. To be able to like actually do that is and see it.
Yeah.
It's like what a concept. And that's like and that's what like historically again just like kind of like unit testing has just like been this kind of like chore. But it's like I like making stories, and I like sort of like leaning harder into the you know and I like major kudos to the Storybook team, I think, for doing this, to be like, by writing this story, you get the documentation
Mm-hmm.
for the component, you get these tests for the component, you get like this sort of, kind of playground, sort of sandbox mode for the component. It's like you're killing a lot of birds with one stone, and it checks out because it's like because it is just like this visual thing. It's like, I need to see what my button looks like. In order to build that button, I need to be able to see it. So it's like you're just kind of like in my view, and granted I've been now doing this for almost a decade, it's like it works so well with like the grain of how you just kind of get work done
Hmm.
anyways, but then you sort of get this like iceberg of like sort of other sort of cool stuff that sort of falls out the other end of it. So I really love that direction, and that focus for Storybook. And that's where it's like, yes, like please have the software kind of like take care of a lot of this stuff for me, or at least like let me be able to sort of go, I'm gonna like play out a few scenarios in my UI, and sort of have the things sort of validate that it's like
Yeah.
doing what I expect it to do. It's like it just makes a lot of sense, and it like really jives with me, the son of an art teacher, like a very visual person, right? And it's like I don't want to like sort of write a bunch of code and like picture a UI in my head. I'd rather actually like see that UI and play it out. So it's really
I love
cool.
that. I love that. I couldn't have said it any better myself. I'm curious. I really do see you as a visionary in all of this stuff, and I really do. I'm curious. Where do you see? over the next, 5, 10 years, the like art and craft of, front end engineering, UI engineering, front end development, this kind of front of the front end space, like where do you see it going, and being the core pillars of like what we need to figure out next?
Yeah. Uh, the short answer is web components.
Okay, okay.
I'm particularly really bullish on web components, especially for these what I kind of call like again this sort of like dumb UI
Yeah,
components, right? These like dumb sort of front of the front end components, and we've been working. We built a few design systems for some pretty large organizations using web components. And even in the last like 3.5 years of doing that, um, we've seen that sort of world come a lot, very
sure.
far
Yep.
along in a short amount of time. And so, sort of extrapolating that out 5, 10 years, like I feel really, especially because it's like this part of the web, it's like it takes
Yeah,
a lot of the sort of like, much like how a lot of modern JavaScript brought a lot of the jQuery world and sort of like bake that into the language itself. I see the same sort of analogy happening with the Reacts of the world, sort of baking those sort of concepts and hard-earned lessons into the web platform itself. And there's still, some like sort of things to work out and iron out, I think, over the like next number of years. But like the promise of this stuff is, again, especially whenever we're talking about here's a
yeah,
button and it looks a certain way and it has all like the props and sort of like hooks that it needs to go, to be able to do that and then deliver that into a React
yeah,
project, Angular project, Vue project, into a Drupal site, which is what we're doing right now. We're delivering a thing that goes in, that gets plugged into a React library or React kind of shell wrapper, and then into a Drupal site
yeah,
directly. And what's cool about that is that it becomes this sort of like really nice handshake where, as I was saying earlier, it's like our users don't care like what tech stack these things are built in. They just want that sort of consistent look and feel. And to have to sort of recreate that same orange button
yep,
across 6 different tech stacks in order to sort of like power all of your organization's sort of UIs, that's a lot of work. So the fact that we now have this delivery vehicle in the form of a web component that could be plugged into all these things, I see it as this like really, in the same way we've been sort of talking about this sort of front of the front end, back of the front end, kind of this like healthy
yep,
handshake in the form of these sort of consumable component libraries. I see this as sort of a healthy handshake between web components handling like the look and the feel and the basic functionality, but then being able to sort of pass that off to these libraries, uh, like the React
yeah,
ecosystem and like Vue and the rest of them, that handle all that other sort of stuff that like I know nothing about, but it's like the routing and the,
sure.
like all of like that sort of like hard state management, all of it. It's like, it's not an either or. Like I see them as being sort of like very like hand in glove, where it's like, yes, like let the web components like do the sort of look and feel kind of stuff, and then plug those into the things that really sort of make it all go and work. So that's probably what I'm most excited about, just because one, we've actually like seen this play out with really good
Yeah,
success, even in like the current state of the landscape. But I do think that like fast forwarding just even like a couple years, I think like a lot of the sort of rough edges and sort of compatibility things and like some other stuff, like there's some challenges around like progressive enhancement, sort of
sure.
other stuff like that with it, that it's like I hope that that's like stuff that we're going to see sort of more attention and focus on, and see some of that stuff mature.
I love it. I love it.
So
I'm super.
yeah.
I'm with you. Like I love standards, right? Because of their transportability. And I've
Mm-hmm.
always wanted that handoff to be better. And it hasn't quite gotten there yet, but there is this, you can see it and feel it almost, right? Like if we can get that
Yeah.
like component standard, like a web component standard, to be able to further isolate ourselves even from the specific tooling, um, would
Yeah.
be amazing, and just be
Yep.
another layer in which our brands can kind of progress without having to do a full top down rewrite every 3 years. And I
Yeah.
just love that. I love that idea.
Yeah, 100%. And along with that, and I think that there's like really cool stuff that's happening right now. If you've seen like Open
Yeah.
UI, there's like sort of like a community group to sort of like get more stuff like I think into HTML proper. It's like I would love to see in the next couple years. It's like boy oh boy, it'd be nice to have like a lot of our like just kind of common, yeah, like accordions and tabs
Yeah.
and tooltips and the stuff that like we just like
Yeah.
have to write modals. It's like half of the sort of common custom elements like already have native component state
Right.
picker modal. Like those already exist. They're just like kind of for whatever reason like half baked or like not done. So it's like I would love to see just more and more stuff like live in
Yeah.
HTML, and I'd love to see sort of like a more accelerated rate of being able to sort of like just move a lot of this stuff down into that sort of standards
Yeah.
level and just sort of like just save us all a lot of agony, because like my god, like how much time and effort have we all wasted on like sort of building those custom drop downs. They're just like, can't we like figure out a way to just like not have to do that
Yeah.
anymore? Isn't that what this is supposed to be about? So it's like I see like web components as like a, there's like this ability to sort of like make your own HTML tags, but I'd love that as like an intermediary layer into just sort of like getting more things into the specs so that like we all just like don't have to do as much work anymore. So because we got bigger fish to fry.
Totally.
Like we really do. It's like I just like it is amazing. Like if you were to sort of do the thought experiment of like for a custom drop down, it's like how many thousands upon thousands of hours have gone in for everybody
Oh
all
yeah.
over the
Yeah. Yeah.
world to have to like write that stuff and to do it in a way that isn't going to be as
Yeah.
accessible as a standardized sort of control. It's like, can't we just like solve that once
Yeah.
and then just like we all just use it? So I hope I see initiatives like Open UI and sort of some other stuff like being like good um sort of
Yeah.
nudges in that direction. I think so. So I'm confident. Like I feel good. I know that like we're going to get there. It's just, of course, the future can't come fast enough, I think.
Never can. It never can. Yeah, I like the idea of atomic design kind of being like outdated in a sense because of all the atoms are just in the platform now, or you have like shared
Yeah,
components
yeah, that's right.
for all the atoms.
Right. It's like you just have those. You just sort of get those atom level things for free, and even to an extent, again, like a modal, for instance, it's like to not have to worry about the everything that
Yeah.
goes into making a modal functional and accessible and all that stuff. It's like, man, oh man, like that is not just an atom. That is like a pretty significant piece of kit from a logic sort of standpoint. To be able to just kind of get that stuff for free would be just so incredibly
Amazing.
welcome.
Yeah. Well, Brad, thank you so much for this. This has been a delight. I always enjoy talking with you, but I think just hearing the intersection of atomic design, kind of all the things that have really happened in the industry, like just in the last like less than like 10 years, it's just really cool to like sit down and think about it and think about what happened and like where it can go and the craft of front end engineering, what it's going to mean over the next handful of years. It's been an absolute delight. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. This was great.
Cool. If you're watching this, thank you so much. We're glad that you're here. If you liked it, give us a thumbs up. Thumbs up. If you didn't like it, give us a thumbs down, but tell us why. And tell us why it was me and how awesome Brad is. So that's it. We'll see you in the next one. Thanks so much. Bye.